My name is Joshua Waits. I am the archivist at Virginia Theological Seminary. Today is May the 8th, 2023 at approximately 10:18 a.m. I'm here with the Reverend Blake Ryder. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So let's start with just some basic biographical information. Let's start with having you tell your full name.
William Blake Ryder, and I go by my middle name of Blake.
Blake. Do you prefer Blake or Reverend Blake? Father Blake?
Blake's fine. Yeah.
Would you please tell us your pronouns and how you identify?
He, him, and I identify as a, I think the right way to say it is cisgender gay man. Is that right? Okay. I'm trying to learn the new lingo.
We always are developing. When and where were you born?
I was born in 1955, which makes me 68 as of now. And I was born and grew up in a small town north of Tulsa in Oklahoma called Nowata.
Oh. Would you mind giving us a short description of sort of your life prior to coming out?
Yes. So growing up in that small town, I was in a family of with 3 children. I was the middle child. I knew that there was something about me that was different when I was 6 or 7 in playing with my playmates. Didn't know what that was, but I knew it was something that was a little off from everybody else. Before I was in puberty, somehow I knew that I was emotionally, sexually attracted. Not much sex going on before puberty, but that kind of feeling was definitely in my psyche with other boys. I was not sexually active until after college, so I suppressed that. I don't know if I suppressed it. I didn't act on it, that's for sure. As I've grown up, I've realized there were other young men in Nowata, of course, who were gay, my age and around my age. None of us, of course, talked to each other about that at the time. I was one of the, there was a book written, I think, in the 70s or 80s called The Best Little Boy in the World. And the thesis of that guy's story was that in order to hide his non-normative sexuality in those days, or his queerness, as they probably would have said about him, he chose instead to excel in everything he did and to be so busy doing things and be noticed about the things that he did, that the fact that he never dated or had a girlfriend would be obfuscated by all of that activity. I didn't know that that's what I was doing in junior high and high school, but that's what I did, without a doubt. After high school, I went to college at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa. I was on a full scholarship as a student trainer with the athletic program, basketball and baseball. That was a full ride and a stipend. And it was, of course, against the rules of that, and still is, I guess, at that Christian college, to engage in any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage, and specifically named, you could not be a homosexual. So I definitely suppressed my thoughts and feelings. I balanced the full scholarship at a good university versus my ability to be intimate with somebody and experiment with that. And I chose to wait till I was out of college to not jeopardize a very expensive and generous full scholarship that I had. So it wasn't until I got out of college that I became sexually active, and I was 23, I guess, or 4, and didn't come out, so to speak, until I got out of college in 78. I guess that I came out after I had moved to Houston in 82, working in the oil and gas business. And I was living a story during the week that was full of they and thems and us and we. And everybody else was talking about their husbands and their wives and their kids and what they did. And one weekend, I decided I was just going to start saying me and Stephen. And I put a picture of Stephen on my desk that Monday. And after that, I just told my weekend stories or talked about my life as being a couple with Stephen, who I was a couple with by then. During that time, I became an Episcopalian while I was at Oral Roberts. Stayed an Episcopalian, since then, obviously. As I was in Houston, I was going to an Episcopal church that was on the neutral end of acceptance of gays and lesbians. Eventually, Steve and I moved into town, deeper into Houston, in what's called Montrose, which then was the gay neighborhood. And I began to go to church at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which was the, quote, gay-friendly church in Episcopal church in Houston at the time. This is the mid-'80s. And then became, even in my life in the church, completely out, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Were you raised Pentecostal?
No, I was raised in the Disciples of Christ denomination, First Christian Church kind of place.
So, and the disciples of Christ were or have been sort of, I would say, moderately progressive denomination. So you weren't raised in a sort of a conservative fundamentalist background.
Oh, absolutely not. My folks were conservative in a civic kind of way. Dad didn't go to church. Mother did in the context of taking us to church. At First Christian and nobody, I never heard a fire and brimstone sermon, never heard a hell sermon. I almost said Father. Pastor Draper would never have preached a sermon about homosexuals going to hell. He wouldn't have marched in a gay pride parade, but he would not have. There's no way he would have done that. I heard that in society and in magazines, the news magazines and the newspaper and at school, and people in their casual, never directed at me, but they're just their casual crap talk about fags and queers, but never at church. Yeah, that never came up in my religious upbringing.
Was it sort of a culture shock for you when you went to Oral Roberts?
Well, to some extent, it was the charismatic expression of the Christian faith was totally unknown to me. I grew up with kids who went to the Assembly of God church, and they would have revivals sometimes downtown outside aimed at youth, and I would go stand, in the midst of the crowd for that, and knew of exuberant worship and preaching styles. I'd watched Oral Roberts on TV before. By the time I was going to school, the great tent revivals and healing services were things of, videotape only. They weren't currently happening. He had more of a variety show on TV than a healing ministry on television. But it wasn't totally unknown to me. The culture on campus at the time was mixed. You were not required to manifest expressions of baptism in the Holy Spirit as a student. Faculty were. To be tenured, you had to be baptized in the Holy Spirit and speak in tongues, which was awful, still is, if they still have that. And I know faculty who faked it, as you can do, but there was pressure amongst the student body, wing chaplains and things that were on campus that were highly pressurized to help you get the Holy Spirit if you didn't already have it, and teaching you tricks or linguistic things you could do with your mouth to kickstart the praying in the Spirit experience, which I always resisted and said no thanks. it was, like I said, it was while I was at ORU that I became an Episcopalian. There was a group of us who were not finding anything interesting in our churches that we went to throughout on Sundays and during the week. And one of the guys came back and told us of a group of men at St. John's Episcopal Church that met every Saturday morning for a hot cooked breakfast at 8, and then had the Lord's Supper with real wine. That was an eye opener, and then had Bible study every week, and we were welcome to go. So I didn't know it was the Brotherhood of St. Andrew meeting at St. John's in Tulsa, but that's what it was.
Mhm.
And we went, and a great group of students began to go to St. John's. We all sang in the choir. We were all confirmed or received eventually over our, life at the university. And eventually 6 or 7 of us became Episcopal priests. It's quite a manifestation of ministry there at St. John's that happened. And I've been back once to meet with the, well, that's where I go to church when I'm back home in Oklahoma, but I've gone to, they had a Brotherhood of St. Andrew meeting once that I went to, and they spread the word, that one of the young men was coming back. I was in my 50s by then. And I realized then that those old men that gathered at 8 o'clock on Saturday mornings were more like 28 and 30 and 32 at the time. Now they're all now in their 70s and 80s, but at the time they really weren't old men. They were just men meeting for Bible study and the Eucharist. But they had a good ministry there. They had no idea, because we all got ordained after we left ORU. Only one of us was in Oklahoma, and they did not know that story at all. So that was heartwarming to go back and see them. I didn't remember them individually. They didn't remember me individually, but they remembered us. And so it's a great way to be introduced to the church.
What was it like being a openly gay man in the Episcopal Church in the 70s and 80s?
Well, in the 70s, by the time I even once while I was at ORU, I think I went to a integrity meeting at Trinity Church in downtown Tulsa. I certainly went to a couple of those after I graduated. I stayed in Oklahoma until 82, living in Tulsa and Bartlesville, where Phillips Petroleum is headquartered, and so my gay social life was in Tulsa, even when I didn't live there. Bartlesville is just less than an hour away, and I would often go to church at Trinity. And although they hosted the integrity chapter, and I guess the vestry knew that, it was certainly well publicized. The rector came to support those who came to the meetings, and but there, in those days at Trinity, you wouldn't have seen a couple's pictures in the pictorial directory, or they wouldn't have smooshed at the peace, or probably not even hugged each other at the peace, not hold hands. It would have been a very much at the worship services, don't ask, don't tell, in the late 70s. And then in Bartlesville, when I went to church at St. Luke's there, very, very much the same. I knew there were gay and lesbian women there, gay men and lesbian women, but nobody was out at church back in the late 70s and early 80s in Oklahoma, at least. In those two parishes, I should say, at least. That's all I really know, but I suspect it's the same everywhere.
Sort of moving chronologically, the 80s roll in. You say you're working in, did you say the oil
and gas? Yeah.
Oil and gas industry. You put your partner's picture on your desk. You try to live openly. And it's Steve, right? Or Stephen?
Stephen, yeah.
Stephen. Are you and just out of curiosity, did y'all remain, are y'all still together, or is that a long-term relationship?
It was long-term. Stephen died in 94. We were together about 12 years before he died.
I'm so very sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, as the 80s roll in, of course, is also when, you know, the rumor started this mysterious disease, which of course becomes AIDS and becomes the full AIDS crisis.
Right.
I'm interested in sort of two aspects of your life. One, just how did the AIDS crisis affect you and your community in general? And then how your faith as an Episcopalian sort of interacted with the AIDS crisis as well.
Sure. I was still single when AIDS first reared its head, I forget the first thing we called it, SID, PSID, CID. I don't remember. I don't
GRID
remember.
was the one I remember. The
What was it?
GRID, gay-related
Immunity disease.
immunity disease.
Yeah, that was one. Yeah. So I was still single and still bar hopping and promiscuous in my sexuality when it first began. Stephen and I got together in the winter of 82, 83, and dated for a very short time before we realized that we were in love and, and committed to each other and began to live together and live our life together. But in those days, before Stephen died, before Stephen and I met, I had countless friends die. There was a magazine in Houston that came out every Friday. I think it still does, called TWIT, This Week in Texas, TWIT. And it was to the point where everybody would get their copy of TWIT at the bar or the restaurant. And the first thing we did was go to the back and read the obits to see who we knew, who had died this week that we knew. And it's just every week for years. The church I went to was St. Stephen's, and people there were dying in rapid pace. I don't know how many funerals we did in those days. I wouldn't say countless because I could go and count them, but dozens and dozens and dozens, I'm sure well over 100. Also, we were the only church at the time, the only mainline church that would have a funeral for people who died of AIDS. So we had funerals in the church, or our priest Helen would go to the funeral home or the graveside and do services for someone who wasn't involved with the church but wanted a minister present. The nearby Methodist church became in the same vein, which is great. And of course, Unitarian churches, soon walked into that path as well, which was great. And then at about that time, an MCCR church was founded in Houston, and that opened up a Christian expression that a lot of people, were able to take advantage of. So that's great. At work, people died by the ones and twos and threes, and probably, a dozen over those early years. I worked at 3 different oil companies during those days, Phillips Petroleum and Scurlock Oil, also in Houston. And then I was recruited into Union Texas Petroleum in Houston, where I stayed working with them for the rest of my life, although not in Houston, all of it, but the rest of my career in the oil and gas business. So at UTP, certainly it got into the multiple, hands of people I knew that had died. In my personal life, that's intertwined with my experience in the Episcopal Church. St. Stephen's was the gay Episcopal church in town. Not that gay people didn't go to the cathedral and Parmel Memorial and St. Andrew's in the Heights and other places, but again, it wasn't the kind of place where you could put your arm around your partner's shoulder at church or smooch at the peace or, be in the doctoral directorate together, that kind of not only being out, but normative, behavior. That was true only at St. Stephen's for a long, long, long time. We very quickly got involved, though, with some other churches that were doing what we called back in those days AIDS respite care teams. And we would be referred to people who were living alone and were in dire straits, at least of companionship and someone to talk to, and perhaps in the context of food and rent assistance and things like that, until some services became available, which eventually did in Houston. And that's part of my story too. So lots of work with the AIDS respite care teams, being with people while they died, helping them write their will or their instructions before they died. And as the people we dealt with across our parish teams became the reality of the horrible circumstances people would find themselves in as they lost their job, either because they were fired or because they were too sick to go to work. And before SSID was readily available, if at all, to people with AIDS. We began to knock around the idea of opening a residence facility for people who couldn't live decently in their last days. There was already a hospice in town that was started by the cathedral that's still in business now, which would be 40 years later, I guess. And it was started as a hospice for people with AIDS. Not anymore. It's wide open for anyone who needs that care. But so at the very end, you could get to hospice at Omega House, but it was before the very end that people were in dire straits. So we kept knocking the idea around. Three of us finally decided to take a deep breath and do something about it. Talking with our priest, Helen, we decided to not approach the vestry to make it a parish event, because by a dotted line, if not a solid black line, it would come under the purview and review and commentary by the bishop. And at that time, the bishop in Texas, Bishop Benitez, we didn't trust and didn't like, and because he was not supportive of gay and lesbian people. Several nightmare stories about that. So we decided to go on our own. So we got together with another group of people, a lot of people from the church, but Connie, Ed and I were the principal people who founded what we called Milam House. We found an old house that was boarded up with plywood over the windows, and broke the plywood off and broke into the house to go walk around, and figured out who owned it. Turned out it was a guy who had been a potentate of the local shrine organization, and I was a Shriner. I'm still a Mason. I was a Mason then and a Shriner. So I didn't know the guy, but I contacted him to see what kind of interest he had in doing something with the property. So he agreed to rent it to us for something like $10 a month if we fixed it up, with the opportunity to buy it eventually. So we began to tear down the plywood and mow the grass and get some interest in the community. Eventually, I wrote a grant request to HUD for the money to buy and renovate the facility for $1 million, and we got it. So suddenly we had $1 million to spend, and of course, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but the design community, the architecture community in Houston was very gay friendly, if not gay rich, with people, and they got behind the program, and we had a big event where each design firm or architectural firm took a room and designed it in their own way, and then we had a big open house and raised a whole lot of money. Eventually, Milam House was open, and was in business for probably 4 years, providing that in-between place to stay. It also was a place to go and die if you did not need medical care as you were actively dying. If you needed IV or the administration of medication, we couldn't do that. So then we would bundle folks up and take them to Omega House. But if it was just a matter of the body was just slowly stopping and and they didn't want to go to anywhere with IVs or that kind of help. And we had dozens of people die at Milam House, but that wasn't its exact mission. By the time 4 years later, within 2 years, Stephen had died in my life, and my company asked me to move to Tunisia in North Africa and open our exploration activities there. So that was just 6 months after Stephen died, and I thought about that a lot, and talked to my family and Stephen's family and my priest Helen, and finally decided to go ahead and go. And so that began a great adventure in my life, to be in North Africa for 4 years. And in that process, Connie also moved out of Houston, and the other founder moved also. And the new board didn't, I guess, have the energy or whatever to maintain it. So, as eventually happened in many places around the country, Milam House merged up into a bigger organization that provided aid services, and it became their housing thing. Then that organization got merged up into the biggest of the organizations, AIDS Houston, and they eventually closed it. It's now a dentist office, I think. I remember last time I drove by. The interesting thing, when we ran the title search to buy the property, we found out that before this guy owned it, who had essentially boarded it up, that he bought it from the cathedral. It had been the deanery for the cathedral for about 40 years, and all the deans at the cathedral and their families had grown up there, including Bishop Hines, who was eventually the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. He lived there, and Dean Richardson at the cathedral was the last dean to leave there, because a freeway expansion happened, and their front yard became part of the access road to the freeway. So it was a less interesting place for a deanery, and the cathedral sold it. But that was a happy coincidence. A lot of people at the cathedral were thrilled to go back into the house after 30 years and remember the bathroom and the hallway, and some of the kids that grew up, they were then adults who grew up there as kids. That night was a lot of fun with them. So the AIDS epidemic in Houston became a big part of my life, all entwined within my faith and my friend's faith at St. Stephen's.
Thank you. Were you active in any other organizations of activism, or was your major focus doing this hospice care?
No, at the exact same time, I was senior warden of the parish, which was bad timing, and also the worshipful master of my Masonic lodge the same year. I thought Stephen was going to kill me before he died. So I've always been very active in the Masonic lodge, and was in Houston in those days, and the Scottish Rite associated with the Masonic lodge. So that was my I saw Masonry as one of my relief valves to the pressure at work and the pressure of getting Milam House. Something I could do that was just fun for me. But I was very, very active in that for decades. Not so much now, but I was then. So between the lodge, Milam House, and St. Stephen's, that was pretty much my life, as in addition to my life with Stephen, of course.
And so Stephen passes away, and you move to North Africa, and this is in the early 90s?
94.
94?
Yeah.
And then you were in Northern Africa for 4 years.
Yeah.
And you come back to the States, and I'm assuming somewhere a year or two after that, you start discerning a call to the priesthood.
Yes. While I was in Tunis, there was it still is a Episcopal church there, part of the Diocese of Cairo in the Church of Jerusalem in the Middle East. Our bishop is the bishop in Cairo, the Diocese of Egypt and North Africa. He has from Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. Quite a big diocese. In each of those countries except Egypt, there's one expat church for the expats that live in town, and with some local, expression as well. In Egypt, I think there's 12 churches, and they're interestingly completely equally divided between 6 expat and 6 indigenous churches. While I was there, I arrived and became good friends with the vicar, Paul Gordon Chandler. He's now the Bishop of Wyoming. I just saw him last week. He was here in town he was in Houston pushing a new book he's just written, which that's over there waiting for me to read. But he and Lynn and his family quickly left. He moved to the UK to be president of the SPCK for a couple of years. And so of the 4 years we were there, we were without a vicar for almost 3 years. And during that time, the bishop in Cairo appointed me as lay reader in charge of the parish. So I began to lead morning prayer on Sundays, and I played the piano for the hymns that we sang. It was the only English-speaking church in the country at the time. So we had every denomination present from the US and Europe and South Africa and Southeast Asia who were not Roman Catholics, who wanted to go to church. Very few Episcopalians or Anglicans. Sometimes it was the British ambassador, the American ambassador, me, and one other couple who were Episcopalians or Anglicans who were there. So that was by then I had been senior warden of the parish and very involved in the life of the parish of St. Stephen's. So, being in charge, so to speak, of a community that only met on Sundays, and had no ministry during the week and no programs during the week was not, an impossible thing to do as a layperson. And so I enjoyed that and got more and more involved in the life of a parish in a different way than I had been even as senior warden. And then a Methodist family moved into town who were there to learn French in the context of their future missionary activity. So Tom came to church, his family, one Sunday and introduced himself. And the bishop then, and Tom agreed, of course, the bishop in Cairo appointed Tom as licensed him to preach. And it told him in writing that he was welcome to celebrate a Methodist Lord's Supper as often as he wanted to, but he, of course, could not celebrate the Eucharist according to the rites of the Episcopal Church in North Africa, which was obvious. And also the services were almost identical anyway. We would just say Tom didn't have magic hands because he was a Methodist, not an Anglican or Episcopalian. So for about a 2 and a half, 2 years, Tom was there as he continued to work on his French, and he began to lead the worship services as the pastor and preacher. And then I moved back more into the building and grounds and financial management of the place. There is a church in Tunis outside the old city walls. It's very much in downtown Tunis now. It has the English Christian cemetery with the tombs from the 1600s. There's been an Anglican priest there since 1648. And it was a trading post for English with the Berber people of Tunis. And eventually the Ottomans, when they came in and took over. Lots of stories there. But so my call to the priesthood ordained ministry developed while I was there. And when our company was purchased by Arco, and we essentially were going out of business and had needed to shut down all of our operations around the world. My boss from Houston came to visit, and we were talking about what we were going to do next. He had a job lined up in the oil business, and I was a businessman, not a scientist or an engineer. I was an office kind of guy. I was the manager of all of our operations in Tunis, but the operations were to have things ready when the drillers came in to drill wells, either in the Med or in the Sahara. It was a fascinating 4 years. I learned things I never knew even existed, much less that I would ever do them, and certainly not that I'd be in charge of them. But it's great. Anyway, it's a great year. We were sitting at dinner that first time, and he told me what he was going to do. And he said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't know. My mother, my dad had died by then. I said, my mother wants me to spend most of my money and go around the world and take a trip in my 40s that since my dad died young, she said, don't think you can do it in your 70s because you might not live to 70. So you got time off, you got a big pot of money from the sale of the company. So go enjoy yourself. And because I talked to her about buying a house or going to get my MBA or going to law school, or never mentioned going to seminary. And she said, well, you could do all those things. What you ought to do is go around the world. So I told that to Stephen. We had a big laugh. And he said, well, you're going to be a priest, aren't you? And I said, what? And he said, all the years you've been here. And then he said, and when I still see him, he still says, you were the best overseas manager we had in the whole company. There's not a doubt about that. You were the best person running the overseas office. But the only time your eyes really lit up while we were there is when you would say something about what you were doing with the church. So we all talked about it all the time when we came back. That the trip was this and this and this. And then we told people at the office what you were doing at the church because you talked about it so much. And I said, you have got to be kidding. He said, no, really, that's what everyone will remember from Tunis about you. I said, really? He said, yes. So that let me begin to think a little bit more about what I might want to do. Bishop Benitez had just retired as the bishop in Texas. Bishop Payne succeeded him. I knew Bishop Payne when he was just a rector, although he was a rector of St. Martin's in Houston, the biggest church in the denomination. But I knew him then. He always had said that being gay or lesbian was not a bar to ordination, but you had to be celibate. He would say, just as I would say to any straight candidate, if they're not married, you have to be celibate. So you have to be celibate. So I thought about that and thought about that. So I did take the trip around the world, and spent a whole lot of my money. Spent the rest of it going to seminary, but I spent some of that money that I got from all the settlements of the company going out of business. And when I got back, I eventually got the package of the paperwork for the diocese and talked to my priest, Helen, and we were suspicious of how it would go. There had not been ever an openly gay or lesbian person put themselves forward for consideration to be a ordinand or a candidate or postulant in the diocese. And not that anybody had been turned down, but nobody had presented themselves who was out. So, but I was. I had been at diocesan council at that time for a decade as a delegate, and was the voice on the floor of that was contrary to the bishop's homophobia. And as resolutions would come up, or he would make statements in his address, and we, the brain trust of the LGBT clique in the diocese, would decide an answer had to be made. Helen would go to be the priest that would talk, and I would go to be the layperson that would talk. So I was out in the diocese to the absolute 99th degree. So we got the paperwork and we began all the interviews and the local committees, and the vestry approved. And one thing Helen and I were cautious about was what would the impact be in the parish if I was denied postulancy. For whatever reason, I might have been denied. Everyone would have believed it was because I was gay. So we didn't want to, we considered what it would happen if there was an eruption over that. But I finally decided that my faith had matured in Houston at St. Stephen's, and my call to ministry, even though it might have blossomed in Tunis, was planted at St. Stephen's. So that's where I was, and I was going to present myself for ordination there.
Mhm.
And if they were going to say no, they were going to have to say no. And then, because at that point, I mean, I still had money left for my settlement. I could have moved to Boston or New York or San Francisco or LA or Sacramento or DC or wherever, and kind of start all over again. And I decided, no, I didn't want to do that. So I entered the process, got before the Commission on Ministry, found out eventually that I was approved by the Commission on Ministry by one vote, like 11 to 10 or 13 to 12, whatever the numbers were. Wasn't supposed to know that, but someone told me that. So then it goes to Bishop Payne, and I presumed, he was going to say no. So I came with my little Union, Texas executive pad book with my questions, and they were all questions about how to move on to another diocese, because I knew once I had engaged the Commission on Ministry in Texas and I had to disengage from them, I had to tell the next diocese that had happened. I didn't know how all that would work. So when we met, he said, I've decided to approve your apostolacy. And I was stunned, silent. And he said, do you have any questions? And I opened my notebook and I said, all my questions are about you saying no. I did not believe you would say yes. So I haven't thought about you saying yes. I've only figured you were going to say no, and that I was going to have to go somewhere else. And he said, well, Blake, why did you think I would say no? I said, well, Bishop, because I'm openly gay. And he said, slapped the table, and he said, but I've always said it's okay to be gay or lesbian as long as you're celibate. And you tell me that you're celibate. I said, and I am. He said, well, then it's okay. And I said, I know, but I thought you would say no. He said, why did you think I would say no? And I said, I thought you were lying. I didn't believe you when you said that you could say yes to someone who was gay. Well, that infuriated me. I could still say no. I said, I know you could say no, and I have my questions ready if you say no, but I'm stunned that you said yes. He said, you are still celibate. And I said, yes, I am. And so we knew each other for, at that point, 15 years. And I said, if I'm ever not celibate, you will be the third person to know. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, I'm promising to you that I'll be celibate. If I'm not, I will know, the guy I'm with, I will know, and I will call you the next day and tell you. And he said, why do you talk like that? And I said, why do you ask questions like this? We don't have to talk about this at all. You're the one that keeps asking me questions. So he finally stopped asking me questions and gave me the choice of where to go to school. But in those days in Texas, you could only go to Virginia, Swanee, or Austin. If you had grown up in Texas or gone to UT or A&M, you could not go to Austin. The bishops wanted you to see something else of the world and the church. Of course, in the old days, Virginia and Swanee weren't much different culturally than Southwest was then. Now all three are wide open for expressions of LGBT life, but that wasn't true in the early 2000s when I was talking to the bishop. I didn't want to go to Austin. Austin had just instituted a program of community action and involvement within the total life of the seminary, working with the Industrial Areas Foundation work. And we were doing that in Houston. St. Stephen's was one of the leaders, and I was one of the leaders in getting TMO, the Metropolitan Organization, up and running in town. I work with the organizers weekly, daily sometimes, in their work. And as I was approaching the decision about ordained ministry, and when I was still working as a day worker in the oil and gas business as a consultant, the decision tree I came to was I would either seek ordination or I would go to work, apply and present myself to go to work for IAF and be an organizer somewhere after they trained me, wherever they sent me. So I was afraid that if I went to Austin in the seminary, I would slip into that IAF worldview even deeper and maybe never come out.
Mhm.
So I didn't want to do that, take that risk as much as I liked that work and their work. Sewanee was too isolated. The dean told me I'd be the first openly gay student there. And I said, well, I didn't say it to him, but I said, well, I'm not going to do that. So I went to Virginia. I'd gone, here's my life in Virginia. I had gone to a visitors weekend the year before when I was still in discernment with the bishop and the parish, and met Marge McNaughton Ayers, the dean of students, and Martha Horn, the dean, and talked about my situation, and told Marge, in all of my righteousness, that even if the bishop said no, I was going to seminary anyway, because I'd be moving to some other diocese, and I was just going to go ahead and get seminary out of the way. So that would be done. And she said, well, probably, maybe not here. We have no problem with you being gay, but if the bishop in Texas says no, we'd have a lot of conversations about you enrolling as a non-diocesan supported student. I said, well, we'll see what happens. So of course, it ended up that I was, so it didn't matter. But so I was out to Marge and the students that I met that year, which would have been, I guess, the spring of 2000. Yeah, the spring of 99. Spring of 99. But the first time I went, and that's where I met some gay and lesbian students from a generation before me, and who were gone by the time I showed up. But I can get in contact with them about being in contact with you if they care to. So then came back the next year as a bona fide postulant and going to be in school the next fall. And so I saw March again and met other students, and they cleverly paired me for my weekend with the host being another gay student who was sort of, well, he was certainly out in his social expression, although I don't think he wasn't out so much with I don't know that his professor would have known that. But so that set me up to meet a comfortable group of people at the school. Some who were seniors, were leaving that spring, but then some middlers and juniors who were seniors and middlers when I showed up in the fall, who were gay and lesbian, and so that made a ready set of potential friends. And I became friends with most of them, I think. It's not an automatic thing to assume, I suppose, but by the time I got to VTS in the fall of 2001, there was a fairly recognized group of out students. When David Waycaster and I showed up with our class in the fall of 2001, I think we would have been some of the students in the past were there with their partner. So in the life of the student body, people knew that they were gay or lesbian because their spouse or their partner came to everything. But as far as students living on campus, David and I might have been the first who were just flat out. And we outed ourselves during the class introductions and those early orientation days. And then from that developed friendships with other people in our class and the upper classes from us who weren't out, but who were gay or lesbian, and some deep friendships and life on campus continued from that. So that's kind of how it was when I got to Virginia.
What was it like when Ruth Anna Hook joined the faculty?
Well, that's interesting stories. Ruth Anna came. If they weren't married by then, probably not in the church anyway. I'm not sure where they moved from, if they were married or not, but she arrived with a partner anyway. And even during her practice classes that had been the year before, which I didn't go to as a junior because they were preaching classes. We knew that she was a lesbian person and had a partner. So that was a cause of some great turmoil amongst the more conservative, traditional, including I would say reactionary, I would say redneck, not very many, maybe less than a handful, but even a lot of people would go harumph. 4 or 5 of them went a whole lot more than harumph. It was awful from a couple of them, couple. 2 of those were in our class. So when all the turmoil began and letters began to be written, and this email was not as much a thing as it is now, but we did have student email so we could talk to each other in our class and things like that. And the 2 or 3 guys I'm thinking of were quite vocal in their renouncing the idea that Ruth Ann was ever even there, and that how dare anyone think they would be required to have a class from her. So we had, lucky in Virginia at that time, I don't know if it's still true, but there were 2 homiletics professors. Ruth Ann was the new one, and Judith McDowell, I'm not saying that right. Judith, anyway, was the other. Very different professors, very different approaches. So that was great. We were going to be exposed to 2 completely different ways of preaching. And it had been traditional at Virginia at that time. There were 2 church history professors, 3 theology professors, 2 preaching professors. Everyone took the classes to balance out or just get experience with multiple professors. There was no question that that's what you did. And back in those days, the syllabus of the student guide told you which classes to take and which sections to take up until I think the 2nd semester of your middle year. And then there were some electives. But before that, you just took the classes the seminary told you to take. And these guys began to say, no, I'm not. Next year, I'm not going to sit in a class with Ruth Ann Hooks. It got to the point of a student body-wide meeting, a meeting of the seminary in the old Lady Pate Auditorium, and the dean gave that crowd, a voice to express their ideas. It was just awful. Some of the things they said were just disgusting. But Ruth Ann came anyway, of course, and I guess it was the dean. I'll say the dean. She was the buck stopped at her desk. She blinked, and I guess the faculty blinked, and students who didn't want to sit in class with Ruth Ann did not have to. Well, that infuriated the liberal crowd at the school, as I would say, as much as the idea of being in Ruth Ann's class had infuriated the conservative crowd. We felt betrayed, dishonored, disrespected. That was a tough time for the seminary. I can't imagine what Dean Horn and her academic dean, who was a great friend of mine, whose name slipped my mind right now. Yeah, Dr. Dean Stratford. Yeah, what they went through. I don't know what Ruth Ann went through and her family. I took a class. I guess that was during my junior year. I forget when it was, but yeah, that was during my junior year. She showed up in my middle year, and I took a class with Ruth Ann, kind of in a principal kind of thing, if anything else, and enjoyed the class and learned things from her. And I don't know how it's continued now. That was 18 years ago. It's hard to believe. So obviously she's still there. She must now be the senior homiletics professor, at least in terms of tenure, if not in a named chair. So I hope
she's also dean of students.
She is.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's awful. Homiletics and dean of students. Good Lord. I hope she got a big raise. Man. So that was a one of the landmark moments at seminary in the life of the LGBT crowd. Well, there were no transgendered people there at the time. I don't know if there were any bisexual people there at the time. There were certainly lesbians and gays, the vast majority of whom were still in the closet officially, but socially, and around the lunch table and in the common room. There were a lot of people who were out enough at those times. Marge told us back in those days, and I'm sure it continued to be true for many years in the seminary, what I thought was good advice. She said that if you come to seminary and are gay or lesbian, and your bishop knows and your mother knows, then if you want to be out in this community, that, good for you. You'll be accepted and validated, and nobody will blink an eye, if in the seminary administration or faculty. If you're not out to your bishop and your mother, don't think that you can be out here and they won't find out, because they will. It's just the nature of the human condition. If you're in the closet in your process and you're not ordained yet, you got to think about that closet door real hard. And that was good advice for people who were closeted, I thought. Some of them came from very hard-headed bishop dioceses that would be in a lot of trouble. It'd be the same thing if Bishop Payne found out that I had become sexually active, when our deal was that I would not. I didn't have to sign anything, but we had a deal, which I honored and still do, as it happens. Our class, our junior class of that year, the class that graduated in the spring of 2004, there were more than a handful of gay men. Other than David and I, none of whom were out. And there were some women in the class who were lesbian, who were not out. And then there was women, we had students in our class who discovered, who it became obvious because they came out and told us were gay or lesbian after they left, who had been married to a straight, in a straight marriage, and life ensued, and it came to pass that they were gay and lesbian, and have since come out in a completely open way. So we had a wide expression at the school then. And no doubt there were people who were closeted then who still are, and who I don't know. Of course, that's certainly possible, and perhaps even likely given the environment.
While you were at VTS, were there any particular people or organizations that you found to be safe places?
That I found to be what?
Safe places for LGBT.
Oh, safe places. I was lucky enough that my back then we had once a week worship and casual time with a professor who were our advisors for the year. And I was lucky enough that my advisors were always supportive of LGBT issues. Again, I guess I can really just say lesbian and gay issues, because the other two expressions weren't in play that anyone knew of anyway. So those weekly meetings at Judy Fittress Williams' home or Tony Lewis's home, for example, were safe places, without a doubt. And it was an interesting comment that you knew from Tony Lewis's mention and other people. If you were a student who went to Dr. Lewis's home for small group,
or any other reason, you certainly would know that he was a gay man. He had the normal kind of gay man decals and refrigerator stickers and pictures on the mantle that anybody would have who was out in their life. So, it's I can hear him chuckle about who didn't know. But if you didn't go to his home, you wouldn't know. He didn't make there was no LGBT commentary in his classes or around the lunch table in the refectory come from him. But those were safe places. So there was no organized group on campus. My circle of friends would have been the safest place casually to enter into. But even then we had closeted members. This is what I asked you before about how they might be interviewed, who I think are still closeted, who found themselves able to hang out with the crowd only when it was all gay or lesbian. The mixed crowd that would develop. We had a good friend in class who was the daughter of a priest who was gay, for example. There's a wide circle of friends who were completely gay and lesbian. Not to say friendly would be such an understatement. It would be crazy. It was a safe place, at least as I viewed it. It wasn't safe enough for some of the crowd. So they'd go with us to a restaurant or whatever, if it was just the gay crowd, but they wouldn't be seen with the gay friendly crowd if there were straight people involved. My group of friends, I think in the 3 years I was there, we went to a gay bar once, and it scared the youngest members that were with us, so we never went back. It was a country western dance hall in DC on a very dull night. I can't imagine what scared them. I don't know that anybody ever danced while we were there, but they were just shaking in their boots, so to speak, the whole time we were there. So that was we weren't a bar hopping crowd in the sense of our social life. We'd go out to eat at restaurants or go shopping or go to a movie or something.
Mm-hmm.
But sadly, there was no organized expression of that at all on campus at the time.
In the 90s, when Martha Horn sort of led the effort to change the seminary policy that would allow openly gay and lesbian people to attend seminary and earn an MDiv, several of the faculty opposed it and then remained on faculty.
Mm-hmm.
I won't. Well, we can know that. By this point he was gone, but Dean Reed had been a contributor to a book. I think Bill Stafford had. Dr. Pritchard had. I believe all of them had contributed to the book, Wholesome Example, which was sort of a argument against gay people's ordination. And then there were professors, of course, who wrote and published in the opposite. And the whole call to a holy living statement was these two sort of opposing factions coming to, these will be the things we agree on. What was it like? Because all of that was sort of open record. Everyone knew who those people were. What was it like being a student, sort of having faculty? Did those faculty who had been on the opposite side of changing the policy, did they treat you differently?
No, not at all. Not at all. And those issues never came up in Rich's classes. I never had a class with Bill I'll tell you a story about my relationship with Bill in a minute, but never had a class with him. Dr. Pritchard was an interesting case. There was never any issue at all. I found him extraordinarily reserved and standoffish to everybody. I wondered if that was because of that tension and if he had ever been different in his personality. I know this. I know the story that when he graduated from Virginia, he opted out of being ordained because women could not be ordained at the time, and he was not going to be ordained till women could be ordained. So that's an incredible. I'm sure that story's true. I didn't hear it from his lips, but I heard it from many people in the diocese. That's an incredible statement of principle and self-sacrifice, self-giving from him. So I know that principled position was in him, but I didn't experience as we would grouse and complain about professors being this or that, or be happy with them or mad at them. We know whatever the flavor of the day was. When Bill would come up, there was, and every people would often arch their eyebrow and ask us the same question, those of us who were out. And there was never any singling out of us at all. I remember one lecture he gave on the prayer book and the development of marriage issues over the centuries. And in one case, in the millenniums. And it being built, he gave Dr. Pritchard, he gave an extremely erudite and documented, and his lectures were incredible. He wrote them out word for word and then read them to us, but in an engaging way. Wasn't a dull talking head kind of way. But he very, I don't know whether he did it intentionally, but there was often room for 3 minutes of questions after the lecture. And the point was you were to ask your questions in a small group when we had an hour and a half with him and 8 or 9 of us, instead of in the room with 50 of us. So his lecture on marriage in the church progressed through the centuries, and his constant refrain was, the church has constantly rethought its opinion on marriage. He said that over, or something very much like it, over and over and over again. Worked through the revolutionary, the colonial times when there was no priests around, couldn't get confirmed, couldn't get your babies baptized. Walked through all that, the founding of the church, marriage changed, prayer books came, marriage changed. And those of us on the liberal side tend to step with each other. And we were literally looking down the row and asking 101 at each other and going, where's he going with this? Is this an epiphany that we're going to see? Because he has said the church has changed its theological position on marriage constantly over the 1800 years. There's been any kind of organized thought on that in a Christian sense. Again and again, and the church changed its mind, and the church changed its mind. And then he came to the issue of gay and lesbian marriage, and we all took a deep breath, and he said, there's without a doubt that the church, the hierarchy of the church will soon authorize the blessing of and marriage, eventually marriage of gay and lesbian people in the Episcopal Church. It will take a long time for the church-wide bodies to individuals to accept that, but the church will do it just as it has changed its mind over and over again. And so we were just dumbfounded, just gobsmacked, as the Brits say. And someone raised their question and said, when do you think that's going to happen? And the bell rang or whatever, the class ended, and he said, sometime in the next 500 years. And closed his notebook, and the class ended. We said, oh, what do you mean 500 years? You played with us for an hour, led us down this path, and then you say in the next 500 years.
And this was Dr. Pritchard's class?
Pritchard, yeah, Dr. Pritchard, yeah. He worked us like a drum.
But his contribution, well, he was the editor of the book A Wholesome Example.
Mm-hmm.
And his contribution as a chapter was all about I would say it was a chapter of procedure, about how the church goes about this changing its definition.
Mhm.
And I think like his conclusion, if I'm remembering correctly, was basically the reason why he was saying that it couldn't happen. I think this book was released in the like 89, 90. It was early. It was basically that the church hadn't done all of these mechanisms for it to be one of those things where you could just change. So
Yeah.
basically, diocese shouldn't be acting independently because the church hasn't done the work. In a very historian's way of viewing things. And
Yeah.
I remember I spoke with Martha Horn about Bill Stratford and about the change of policy and how she convinced him to stay on as academic dean, because and she's eventually going to give her oral history as well. And I want to get Bill Stratford's too, mainly so that we can preserve this story, the basically the whole conversation, in which she said that it's important that the seminary shows that the church, that the individuals in the church can disagree strongly theologically and yet still work together and still treat each other as siblings in Christ, even though they have different theological views. Do you think that was your experience of the professors while you were at VTS?
Oh yeah, that was my experience. And I was as out as anybody. I mean, there was no question about reading body language or style of voice or tone of voice from the cafeteria lunch table to figure out somebody was gay. I was just out. Stephen came into my conversations easily and lightly, as he still does, from my experience in the church, which would include Stephen. When I go back for convocation or a class, if there's a seat next to Bob, I go sit next to him. I've done that many times over the 20 years. Same with Rich. I think I might have been in Rich's wedding. I was saying it. I was an usher at his wedding in the chapel.
Richard Jones?
Hauser. Jones. Yeah, Richard House. Yeah, Richard Jones. Yes, the church, the missionary, church mission professor. Yeah. We never talked about gay and lesbian issues in his class, but we got to be friends. And I don't know how I came to meet his wife. The same way I sit with them at convocation. If there's an empty seat next to them, we get along. I mean, I don't feel like they feel like I'm sitting there to rub their nose in something. We're friends. So
yeah, I read something in like one of the statements that Dr. Jones gave about the whole changing of policy. And what he had a sort of a turn of phrase, and I'm trying to remember it exactly, that I thought was a quite generous phrase, which was basically I think it was that he said, I wait optimistically to be convinced.
no, that's a good turn of phrase. I don't know if he is by now or not, or if he still cares. I don't know.
But I mean, I am very openly out, and he's come to the archives to work on his personal papers, and we had a perfectly wonderful working relationship while he was doing his work on his personal papers and stuff.
Good. Well, say hello for me if you see him again. I like him a lot. I didn't enjoy his class. I didn't think he was a very good professor, but I liked him a lot. When he was given a lecture once on missionary of the church being present in Nigeria, and there were priests from Nigeria in our class, who came for an advanced degree. And that's not to say it's perfectly possible that Rich knew more about the church and Nigerians than a Nigerian knows. That's completely possible. But when they would try to rebut or tweak or add on to his statements, he was extremely dismissive, not because they were Nigerians, I don't think, just because they couldn't possibly know that. My read of it was they couldn't possibly know more than he did because he was the professor and they weren't. They were talking about history. They weren't talking about their own individual lived experience in Nigeria, about something that happened in the 1810s or the 1860s. And one guy was so bold to say, no, Dr. Jones, that's not right. Well, that was not going to be had. He wasn't mean, but he he didn't dismiss the guy physically from the room, but he completely shut him down. And we all, the liberal crowd took great offense that he was so disrespectful of someone living in the story or the result of the story, as to be so dismissive. The same way I would be if somebody was giving the history of the church and opined on LGBT life in the church in the 90s, and I had something to add to the discussion and I was shut down. I'd be very put out from that. And I'm sure my classmate from Nigeria was the same way.
Yeah.
That's the only time I had any negative experience with Dr. Jones, and never with Dr. Pritchard, except he was just the way his personality is what it is. To the students, he might have a completely different personality, in his day-to-day life, but he was very standoffish and not interested in bantering with students. I don't know what my dog is upset about. You never met Dr. Pritchard, you shouldn't be barking. And now Bill Stafford, I never had a class with him, but my first year, my mother took ill and died suddenly over the Thanksgiving break. I wasn't home because it was just Thanksgiving, and I'd been to 50 Thanksgivings at homes by then, so I was staying at school. But my sister called, I flew home and stayed an extra week when she took ill, and as they were trying to figure things out. And so I got behind in my classes, and I took incompletes in everything and came back. So then Christmas break came. It was January term. The Dean Stafford told me to not take any January classes because I could always do that in the next 2 years. Just stay home, be with my family, be with my mom. She got better from the chemo. From an operation. Came home, did the chemo, got even better yet for the specific thing they were fighting, and then she began to get worse again, and worse and worse. I went home. By the time I got home for spring break, she had decided that, at Christmas break, she decided she was going to take no more treatments and just go into a hospice care at a nursing home. So she organized the love seat and the lamp and the everything. She wanted to go to her little apartment, and she went there and lived a quiet life, not a hospitalized life for months. Then I got back at spring break, and she had taken worse, and the morphine patches got stronger and stronger, and eventually they said, the next time we have to up the morphine patch, she won't wake up again. And so we came to that point during spring break, and Mom died on the early morning of the night of Palm Sunday, that night, late after midnight. So I stayed another week or two for the funeral and all that. Came back to school. Was extremely far behind again in all of that spring classes, and I went in to talk to Bill about it, and he was. That was the most pastoral care experience that I had as the recipient of pastoral care, of that I ever have had so far in my life. Well, once with Oral Roberts, I had an experience that was kind of stunning. But as an Episcopalian, I put Bill up there with Oral Roberts on giving pastoral care. I need to tell him that sometime. So he had me take all incompletes early in the spring semester, just declare incompletes and everything. Do what I go to class as I could, do what I could do. He wanted me to completely drop 2 classes and have a more intense fall semester than the semester I was, currently living. And so that's what I did. And so I had to drop New Testament with John Ye. And by the time I took it, it was with Kathy Grebe. So I was really glad to be in class with Dr. Grebe. We took some electives with her later on as well. Again, Bill knew I was gay, and he was, but because besides the academic, the school things, we talked a long time about life and death and living that a Christian life in the midst of that, and it was a remarkable conversation that I'll remember as long as I remember things. I'll remember that. So I never heard a student say that they had a bad experience with Dr. Stafford because they were gay or lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do know there's the issue of the faculty evaluation that at least used to occur at the end of your middle year before your senior year.
Yeah, they still have.
They still have that. And I believe the crowd who was against the change in policy, at least for a time, again, on principle, refused to recommend anybody that they knew to be gay or lesbian, no matter how much they liked them, maybe, or thought they were a good student otherwise. That's the story as I understand it. And further, the stories I understand it is those recommendations came in and then they were put in a stack, and because the recommendation, as I understand it, said because they're openly gay or lesbian and I cannot support that, that's why I'm not recommending them. So the faculty somehow, or the dean at least, eventually decided that those would go in a stack and essentially be set aside, so that when the recommendation went to the bishop, it was the rest of the votes were tallied, and then the asterisk of, and 3 or 4 professors on principle recommend no one who's gay and lesbian, so their votes are not included in the above tallies or something like that. Mm. That's how I understand it was 20 years ago.
I want to understand the operation is similar. You're given an evaluation by the professor. I'm going into the dark. Yeah. There we go.
There you go.
The professor does your Midler evaluation. You're allowed to give response to the professor, and then the professor will give their final response. But the actual, any type of recommendation to the bishop is in the name of the entire faculty. So you don't get just one rogue.
Okay, yeah.
Professor, also in your Midler evaluation, all of the statements that the professors make about you, you are entitled to know, and you're entitled to know which professor made them.
Oh, that wasn't the case 20 years ago. Okay.
And you're allowed to address anything that any professor says in the actual evaluation.
That's good. Great. That's a much better process.
Right. So that way, when a bishop gets the evaluation, they're not just getting one person's opinion and a tally sheet.
Yeah.
They get the official vote, they get the official report, which now the report is also very regimented. Like there's specific things the professors are supposed to address. It can't just be their general opinion of you.
Okay, well, that's a much better process.
Mhm.
I mean, there should be a process that the professor should evaluate.
Mhm.
I'm all for that. Another big part of my experience at Virginia was, two things. One was both the sermons, my senior sermon, in essence, and I guess they still call it that. And my experience at Field Ed were kind of landmark events. At Field Ed, I scouted around various places, and there was a time when I thought I might be suited for work as a church planter. I worked in Bishop Jones' office over at Goodwin House, which was his office and the church planting office for the diocese. And I did that for, I think, 3 semesters. So I got a lot of bird's eye and groundhog view of church planting processes on the diocesan level. And soon came to the realization that I did not want to do that. Although it was a job and I did it. Lots of stories about that. So when I was looking for a Field Ed site, I wanted to experience a church plant rather than St. Paul's K Street or the National Cathedral. So I ended up at St. David's in Ashburn, Virginia, which had been planted by the still current priest, Stephen McWhorter, about 10 years before. And it was and still is, I hope, a booming community. They built a church first with very minimal other facilities, no parish hall, the classrooms for the kids and bathrooms and things like that, but kind of a galley kitchen, but a big church. So on Sunday morning at both the 8 o'clock and the 10 o'clock service, there would be 300 people at each service. Full Sunday school program during each service and during the break and after church. Full choir, organ at both, two different choirs, music at both. It was an incredible place. So I learned a lot that first year, had a great time, taught some classes, enjoyed that a lot, worked with the kids. And Stephen, the rector, was amongst the closeted parish priests in the greater DC area. When the word became known to the gay priests in the area that there was a bumper crop of gay kids, gay students in Virginia in the fall, they organized a really nice cocktail party up on the 99th floor of somebody's apartment building for the gay clergy in the area to meet the gay students, gay and lesbian students at Virginia. So that was our first kind of outing and figuring out who to invite and then who could go. So Stephen was there. So I had met him, and he was amongst a crowd, was known to be a gay priest in the diocese, but not out in the Diocese of Virginia. But when I talked to him about being a seminarian, he said, I am not out, so you must not out me while you work here. But if you want to arrive as an out person, or you want to come out as out while you're here, you can experience that. You be you, and I'll be me, and I'm in the closet, and you do whatever you want to do. And so I said, well, I don't wear name badges, or I don't have a big Q tattoo on my forehead, so life will ensue, and we'll see what happens. So the first year goes by. I preached 4 or 5 times. He was very generous with the pulpit. It's great. I have become and was then becoming a good preacher. So I enjoyed all that. Went home for the summer, continued to clean up stuff from my mom's estate. I came back in the fall and came back to school after the General Convention had ratified Gene Robinson's election as a bishop, at which Bishop Lee in Virginia voted yes as a surprise, and every deputy voted yes except for one lay person, Roger Randall, whose wife used to work at the school.
Mhm.
And the Randalls are giants in the church in the Diocese of Virginia.
This is,
And he's a really,
is this Julia Randall's?
Julia Randall's husband.
Yeah,
Is it
she's my
Roger?
predecessor's predecessor.
Oh, okay.
She was the
Okay.
first archivist here.
I liked the Randalls a lot. I liked her husband a lot as I met him. He's the one that voted no, and we all figured every deputy would vote no from Virginia, and they all voted yes. So it was a huge surprise when the delegation got back, and the diocese, the conservative crowd in the diocese was in an uproar. So Bishop Lee and the deputies said, "We will set up 3 or 4 meetings around the diocese and take our punches, and we'll come and we'll present our opinions of why we voted that way, and we'll take questions and your comments." So the first one was at the seminary for the northern part of the diocese in Old Letty Pate. Students were invited, but with the caveat that we needed to stand in the back for a while because the people from the parishes need to have the place to sit. It was their powwow, not ours. So, but a bunch of us went. Now, the Falls Church and Truro organized protesters outside with signs. Just a classic kind of protest event, prayer meetings outside, signs on sticks that they would, chant to. And so we went in, and the meeting was awful. Of course, mainly people who were mad. The commentary that was directed at Bishop Lee and the deputies was just disgusting, just awful, absolutely awful. But they took their punches. Even Mr. Randall, I think his name was Roger, Mr. Randall, who voted, against Gene Robinson, he tried to defend the process and to honor that the process says you get to vote your conscience, and so, leave them alone, sort of. Then he got smeared as well. It was just awful. So that was like on Monday night. So I talked to Stephen on the phone on Tuesday, and I was going to preach the next Sunday. It was my first Sunday back from fall. It was the first week of the fall semester to preach. And he said, "Well, I heard it was really bad last night." And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, tell me about it." So I told him and gave him some of the quotes of things people said to the bishop. And he just blew up. He said, "That's unacceptable. We're not going to talk like that. You cannot talk to the bishop like that. When they come out here," because Ashburn is a fur piece from VTS. It's a heck of a drive a couple of times a week. That anyone stands up like that, I'm going to stand up and tell them, you got to be respectful, and et cetera, et cetera. So I was just kind of, stunned on the phone. And he said, "You're preaching on Sunday." I said, "Yes." I said, "I'm a little bit worried about, given the climate in the church." And he said, "You'll be fine. You'll be fine." I said, "Do you want to see my sermon before I preach?" He said, "No, I don't want to see it. You will be fine. You will be fine." So I said, "Okay." So that meeting occurred to whatever, if I don't know how that went. It did come to pass that we talked about that. So went out to church. At following church, I was meeting with my parish committee from St. David's. That was, listening to my sermons with a sharp ear, and, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a full day because it was a 5 o'clock sermon, 5 o'clock service as well. So I was going to be out there for the whole day. So I go to the 8 o'clock service and I give my sermon. And Stephen, after the Stephen's deal at the parish, being a really good church planter, he was an amazing guy. I'm sure he still is in many ways. He went to one exit door. I went to the other exit door to shake hands with people. In the morning before service, we had to be dressed and ready to go a half hour before service. And he and I were in the parking lot. And his scheme was that he and I would open the door of everybody's car to as much as we could and greet them in the parking lot to say, "Good morning, glad you're here, glad to see you." That's his kind of style. So he goes to his door, I go to my door. And this is a typical thing. Some people walk by without shaking your hand. I can tell some people were walking by, cutting their eyes at me as they went by. So in the checkout line, I got best sermon I've ever heard. So glad someone's finally talking about that around here. That was a very brave thing to do. And I got a couple of, I don't like those kind of things talked about at church. I haven't told you about the sermon, so I'll do that in a minute. And there was some negative commentary, but not in a mean way, just in a, this is what you say to the preacher on your way out the door. You say you didn't like something. One guy, a founder of the church is only 10 years old at this time, so the founders are still preachers of the life of the parish. He was poking me in the chest. He did that to everybody he talked to. And he said, that was one of the best sermons I've ever heard. I was with you right up to the end. That was a hard poke. He said, I don't agree with how you wrapped it up. Not at all. And he took off to the parking lot to his car. And then he turned around and came back before the next person could come up and shake my hand. He said, and another thing, I heard how it went with Bishop Lee at the seminary, and that's not right. No one talks to the bishop like that. That's not the way we do things. And he looked around the crowd as if he was looking for somebody. He said, if anyone around here talks about withholding our pledge to the diocese, they're going to have to go through me, because I don't agree with Bishop Lee, but you don't do that as an Episcopalian. And he stomped off to his car. So I thought, wow, okay. I guess that was good, all taken together. And then here comes Stephen. And he walks up to me after the checkout line is gone and before the new people are coming in. And he crosses his arms and he said, what did you think you were doing? And I said, what did I do? He said, that sermon. I said, well, okay, what about the sermon? He said, how could you dare preach that here? I said, we talked about this during the week in the context of the deal with Gene Robinson and the life of the church. And I asked you if you wanted to read my sermon, and you said no. I said, what do you mean? How dare I preach this sermon? He said, well, you can't preach it at the 10 o'clock service. You have to preach something else. Preach on the epistle instead of on the gospel. And I said, no. So I know you preach extemporaneously. And what I knew was, as an aside, he developed his sermon during the sequence hymn. He would go back and look out the clear glass windows at the back of the property, which is a beautiful view of the countryside, with his hands in prayer. And because we talked about it, and that's when he put his sermon together. And then he would come back and preach a gobsmacking, brilliant exposition on the gospel with some stories thrown in. He's an excellent preacher. I said, but I don't do that. I have script. If I talk with, there's no way I can give a sermon by just talking. There's no telling what I will say. He said, well, there's no telling what you would say today. And I said, well, I thought about what I wanted to say today and I wrote it down. So I'm not going to edit it and I'm not going to preach a new sermon. You'll have to preach if you don't want me to preach. And that's okay. I'll just sit. You stand up. He said, no, let's see how it goes. He said, this is really bad, really, really bad. And so I said, well, okay. So the second service rolls around and I begin to preach, and in her normal seat on the second row of the really beautiful and pretty big sanctuary sits another founder of the church, Laura. And as I begin to preach, she begins to pray out loud in the voice at this volume. She wasn't yelling, but she wasn't whispering. It wasn't just her lips moving. She was just talking in a voice like this. Oh, Jesus, protect us. Keep this from coming to us. Oh, Jesus, I'm praying for my church. Literally, other than taking breaths, constantly through my sermon. So I sat down, same kind of checkout line, same kind of experience. And Stephen came back madder than he was before. And he said, I spent the entire time being yelled at and harangued because of your sermon. He said, what was it like for you? And I explained, as I said to you, I said, most people said, glad to hear someone preach about this, glad to hear it talked about it. Bishop Lee sure got dealt with poorly. See you next Sunday. Other people didn't, bypass the checkout line, but no more so than people normally do. And some people said that they didn't like the sermon, but that was it. And I told him the story about the founder. He was so vocal in his enjoyment of my sermon until the very end. He said that. And I said, yeah, absolutely. He said that. So he was, nobody's going to talk about withholding pledges around here. And he said, I'll see you next week. So he said, well, okay. So off I went to my the leader of the parish of my discernment committee with the parish, Marilyn Eckert, to her house for the meeting with the committee. And we had a nice lunch and we talked about it. And as usual, we talked about the sermon. And we talked about the construction in the sermon and what I said. There was no commentary on whether or not it was a good thing to say, or if the point was well taken or not. So then I lay down to take a nap because I was going to be there for 6 hours at Marilyn's house. Got up, drove back to the church for the 5 o'clock service. Stephen was in the parking lot leaning against his car. I pulled up. He came over, and as I was opening the door, he put his hand on the door jamb and shut the door of my truck. So I rode down the window and I said, "What's up?" He said, "You can't preach that sermon at 5." I said, "Stephen, like I told you before, it's the only sermon I've got, and it's perfectly okay if you want to preach instead of me." He said, "No, you have to change it." And I said, "I can't." He said, "Just take out the last bit." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm not going to do that. I would have done it on Thursday if you read the sermon. I'm not going to do it today." He said, "I spent all afternoon listening to people complain. All I had to do was defend the church and try to defend you." And then he said, which was a problem he had, "I missed taking my antidepressant pills because I was on the phone so much trying to defend you. What have you done to me? You've destroyed this church." And then I said, rather sarcastic or smart ass, I said, "Well, you should have just not answered the phone, and God damn it, you should have taken your pills. You talk about this all the time. If you're upset, could it be because you didn't take your antidepressant medicine? Don't tell me." And I said, "No." Okay. Anyway, so he said, "No." He said, "Well, you need to not come to the 5 o'clock service. Go on back to school. Probably you'll never come back to the church again. Well, we'll have to think about that, but just go on home." So I go home, try to call Bishop Wimberly on the way home, but he's to pick up his phone. So I leave a brief voicemail and said, "Hope to talk to you on Monday or Tuesday." Called a member of my prayer group at the seminary, and went over to his house and spent most of the night talking and commiserating. So then I went to talk to Jack Hadler, who was the field ed guy then. I told him the story, and called Stephen during the week. He didn't return my phone calls except to say, "Don't come to church this Sunday." Did that for 3 or 4 weeks. Well, this was going to be the 3rd semester of field ed, which at the time you had to have 3 semesters. That was a course requirement. And the bishop in Texas required 3, and sometimes he would say 4, depending on your experience or what he thought about the church you were at or whatever. So as we get into October, and I not doing anything at field ed, I'm getting very, very anxious. So I go talk to Dean Horn, and she was furious at Stephen, and never asked to read my sermon. I sent the sermon to the bishop that night by email. I said, "Here's a sermon I preached," and it's sent the rector, over the edge. And so when we did talk, the Bishop Wimberly, he had read the sermon. He said that you could preach this sermon in any church in Texas, and I would not listen to a complaint. This is your rector's problem, not your problem. Although he said he might, be shit canning your seminary process, but not your sermon's fine. So this went on for 4 or 6 weeks, and finally Stephen agreed to come talk to me and Jack at the seminary, because I still couldn't come back to campus at the church, where I had books, my my Catholic surplus was there. Not a huge deal, but I couldn't even go back and pick that up. So he came, and we had a meeting. And Jack, in his well-structured way, he said, "Okay, Stephen, I want you to tell us what happened. And then when you're finished, Blake, I want you to tell me what Stephen said with no commentary, just telling what Stephen said. And then, Blake, you will tell your side of the story. And Stephen, you will, with no commentary, tell us what Blake said. Is that okay with both of you?" We both said yes. So Stephen did his. I recounted what he said. I gave my side of the story, and Stephen began to talk, and Jack interrupted him and said, "Stephen, you're not doing what we agreed. You need to stop and go back and just recount what you heard Blake say, so we know that you really listened." And he started again, and Jack stopped him and said, Stephen, you're not saying anything. You're just rambling. So again, stop and go back and say what Blake told you." And Stephen jumped up and said, "This is crap. I don't have to do this. I'm not going to do this. This is my church." In the parking lot that first Sunday night, he said something like, to me, he said, you may think you're the bishop around here, but by God, you're not. I'm the bishop here," which I thought was just completely off the wall. Until I found out he hadn't taken his meds, and then, that's a problem. You're supposed to be on meds and you don't take them.
Mhm.
So he began to leave, and Jack got up, and well, you know how big Jack is. Stephen, if Jack and I are 5'10", Stephen is 6'3", and big, not pro football big. I mean, not bodybuilder big, but he carries the weight that size of a frame can do. And Jack went over, stood in front of the door, and said, "You're not leaving. You're at least not leaving until we decide the next time we're going to finish this." Because Blake is now 6 weeks into school and has only been to church once. So we've got to figure this out eventually. And Stephen said, "You can't tell me when I can leave." And he said, "Well, yes, I can. I'm standing in front of the door, and you're not leaving until all we have to do is set a date for the next meeting. That's all you got to do." So we set a date for 2 weeks. Stephen left. Jack and I looked at each other, and he said, "Well, hang in there, and we'll see what happens." So 2 weeks later comes. 2 weeks later goes by, and I get a call from I guess the administrator at St. David's, the parish, that's on my voicemail when I get back after chapel. Says, "Blake, I wanted to call to confirm that Stephen's coming for your 11 o'clock meeting," whatever that time was. And said, he's bringing the senior warden, the junior warden, the chairman of your discernment committee, one other person, and Dwight, his executive associate, just so you know. So I hang up in a daze and start walking toward Jack's office across the Grove, wherever he was in Addison, or one of those buildings. Meet him in the middle, because he's walking to find me, and I'm walking to find him. He said, "Did you get a message from St. David's?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I think I should get my prayer group together, and the 7 of us should come to the meeting too. If he's bringing 6 or 7 people, I should bring 6 or 7 people." He said, "Well, my office isn't big enough for that." I said, "Well, I know." I said, I don't want to do that." He said, "Well, let's just go and see, what we can do." So we met. The chairman of my discernment committee was absolutely furious at Stephen, and was my defender, particularly when she said, "Stephen, you asked me to take the time and invest the time to be Blake's discernment chair, and we did that all last year. We were doing it this year up till the first day he preached, and now we haven't heard anything from him, and we haven't heard anything from you." She pulled out her calendar and said, "I've called you 12 times, and you've not called me back. I've called you 12 times, and you've not called me back." And she's a former senior warden. She said, you can't run the church like this. If you ask me to be the chair of the committee, you've got to talk to me when there's a problem with Blake." The senior and junior warden were supportive of me as a person, but thought the sermon was ill-placed. Stephen was pretty much silent. They went around the room. I was silent. And then Dwight, and it's gotten more and more frustrating. And Dwight, the executive assistant, who was not ordained at the time, he is now. He's a professor at Lutheran Seminary in Minneapolis. He's a great guy, Dwight Seisel. And we were friends. He was absolutely supportive of me, but also aware that Stephen was the rector, which I got all along. And he said, "Well, this is how it is, Blake." He said, "For you to come back you would have to recant your sermon. You would have to apologize in the pulpit and in writing to the parish. You could never preach again. You could not work with the children or youth ever again. And you couldn't teach any classes. But otherwise, you'd be welcome to come back and vest on Sundays, but not do anything. And Jack said, well, that is not a field-day experience. And then he said, Stephen, what do you have to say about all this? And Stephen began to ramble again, just nonsensically, literally. Not that I didn't agree with him. He was saying nothing. And we were all looking at each other in the room, those who were for me and those who were against me, or at least for the system that Stephen was the head of. We're just looking at each other, and he wouldn't stop rambling. And finally I said, okay, Stephen, I said, that's enough. And then I said, if you're not man enough to fire me, I just quit. I just quit. Let's just stop this. And then Stephen, in the breath he took after I said those few words, he said, well, then we have to figure out your field debt situation and how do you get your belongings back and what happens to your grade and he began to talk, and Jack interrupted him and said, Stephen, all of that is none of your business except Blake getting his belongings back. You have nothing to say or no involvement in anything else about the situation. So no questions, no discussion, no planning. That's all between me and Blake. You just got to tell Blake when he can come get his assessments and books. So he said, well, how about tomorrow at 1? And I said, sure, I'll come tomorrow at 1. So they left. Jack and I just looked at each other, took a deep breath. He said, well, we'll figure out, what to do. So I, on my way back before I could get back to my classroom, or my dorm room for the phone, Dean Horn caught up with me. And I guess Jack could talk to her. And she said, Blake, I'm sorry to hear about all this going on. I mean, she knew what the whole campus knew, what the early part of that, the disruption and all. She said, I'm sorry how it concluded. She said, if you have a problem with Bishop Wimberly, I'm ready to call other bishops around the country. We'll get your paperwork transferred. You will be ordained. There's lots of people who will stand with you. Don't worry about that. I said, well, thank you. I said, we're not too worried about with Bishop Wimberly, but there are things to figure out. So, So I get back to my dorm. I figured I need to call the bishop and tell him, the next, because I'd called him every week, or at least with Rebecca, his secretary, tell her what was going on. So I get back and then my phone's blinking. So I have a message. So I listen to the answer machine, and it's Bishop Wimberly. And during the meeting, not knowing the meeting was going on, during the meeting, he called and said, in his way with me, he said, I'm tired of getting these phone calls from you every week. This is just ridiculous, in a very stern voice. And then his voice changed, and he said, so I'm telling you to drop out of class, leave that parish, never go back. Tell Dean Horn that if she's not going to graduate you because of this, she'll have to answer to me, and call me and let me know how it goes. But no more phone calls about St. David's. You're done. Just leave, walk away. So I said, well, okay, Bishop Wimberly, good on you. And that was his and I's relationship as well. We got to be very good friends during my discernment process and since. So I told Jack, so I went to Jack and said, okay, the bishop is okay with me leaving, but what am I going to do? So they found me a spot at St. Luke's in Bethesda with Stephanie Nagley. She was then a trustee of the seminary, I think, or soon was a graduate. Wonderful, wonderful person. And I had a great career there as a seminarian from December of phone call coming in there, and then my spring semester. So my sermon was, the scripture appointed for the day was Moses calling the elders up to the tabernacle to have the Spirit of God descend on them to help him. And while they were up there, Eldad and Medad had stayed in the camp. And they began to preach and prophesy. And Joshua ran up and said, Moses, Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. They're not here with you and the elders. Make them stop. And Moses said, no, Joshua, if Eldad and Medad are prophesying and it is of God, then it is of God. Leave them alone. They can do what they're doing from God. And then the gospel lesson was Jesus and the disciples walking down the road, and James and John, the two little shits, run up and say, Jesus, Jesus, in the town we just left, there's somebody out there prophesying and healing someone, and they're not one of us. You must make them stop. You should bring fire, brimstone and fire down from heaven on them. And Jesus, smacked them on the head and said, listen, that's not what we're going to do. If they're healing people and speaking in my name and it's of God, then it's of God. So leave them alone. So that was the Old Testament and the gospel lesson that I had. So I constructed a sermon around that and around the history of the St. David's Parish. It's sitting on the property of a plantation owner before the Civil War, a woman who organized a Sunday school, a church, and a school that was integrated between the children of the planters and the slaves of the planters. And they worshiped in a one-floor church together, and the slave children were educated with the planters' children. And the Bishop of Virginia came and told her to stop. And she said, this is my property, essentially, go to hell. I'm going to do what I want to do. You can't stop me. And that school continued for the rest of her life. She got involved in the Take the Slaves Back to Africa movement that resulted in Liberia eventually. There's a college over there in her name, Margaret Mercer. So it's on her land that St. David sit. And looking out that glass window where Stephen goes to pray and write his sermon every Sunday is the ruins of the chapel where the white people and the black children worship together. It's their story. So I wrapped that into the sermon. And I said, and the church has moved through slavery issues and then immigration issues and women's ordination issues, and now we're presented with gay and lesbian ordinations. And that's where the church is right now. We don't know where it's going. Pray for the church. And that was my sermon. I didn't say this is just like those other times. I didn't say Gene Robinson deserves to be a bishop. I said the church has struggled with questions constantly through maybe I was channeling Bob Pritchard, I don't know. The church has struggled with issues constantly over the centuries, and we're in the middle of another one right now. That's what I said. Now, in all the other ones, the progressive side prevailed. I didn't say that in my sermon, but that is the case. So anyway, that was the sermon that was so controversial. Bishop Wimberly, couldn't have cared less about it. But boy, Stephen. So I believe that Stephen probably was confronted by some of the movers and shakers of the church and said, either I go or you go. We know you're gay. And if you don't get rid of him, we will get rid of you. That's what I suspect happened. So I go to church the next day at 1 o'clock to pick up my alb and my books, assuming that Stephen's not going to be there. No one's going to be there. And lo and behold, the whole group from the day before is there in the conference room when they talk to me again. So we sat down again and rehashed some of the same stuff. And I finally said, look, I've got to go get back to campus. My chairman, Margaret, was just, God, she was mad, so disappointed in Stephen. So I went to get I said goodbye to all of them, which hadn't happened at the seminary the day before, and went to get my coat, my robe, and my alb. And Stephen came in. He said, well, I hope we can still be friends someday after all this. And I said, well, I don't know if that's going to be possible or not, Stephen. He said, well, I sure hope I can come and maybe I can preach at your ordination. I said, no, I am sure that will not happen. This is just too much. I can't just blink an eye and say this didn't happen. So, no. And that's one of my issues in my spiritual life still, with spiritual directors and my therapist. Stephen's someone that I don't believe I've yet forgiven in my inner life. I can say the words, and I have out loud, and in an attempt to forgive him, but I know I haven't. So that's still a stone in my heart, which is my issue, not his, but that still weighs on me. But through all that, Jack was extremely supportive, and we still check in every time I come back to campus. Dean Horn was, Ruth Anna was, Judith was, the homiletics professors. Most of the students knew what had happened. Because I was at seminary, I was one of the best little boys in the world. I didn't do anything wrong, et cetera, teacher's pet, and et cetera. And so it was a earthquake in my life. I guess it was a tremor in other people's lives who cared about me.
Has he since come out?
Pardon me?
Has Stephen since come out?
No, he'd retired, and the last I knew of him, he was doing an interim at a church on Long Island. I was in New York for 13 years, and when I saw he was on Long Island, it crossed my mind that I would go see him, but I didn't. And he knew. I'm sure he knew where I was, or he could have figured it out. He did. He hasn't reached out to me either, and he's probably back home in Alabama, I suspect.
Mm.
So
Okay.
then, when the end of school year came, it became when the bishop brought me back for 3 or 4 interviews in Texas to be a curate somewhere. Because in Texas, if you go to seminary, you're not guaranteed a curacy when you come back, but everybody gets a curacy when they come back, and the diocese pays half the freight of everything: housing, stipend, pension, everything. So the parish has to come up with half a curate's position for 2 years, and then you fly the nest and go your own way. And of the places that were looking for curates, which is it's a moving target every year, none of them would give me a call at home in Texas, and so that became the next gay and lesbian issue for me at Virginia. And while I was at Virginia, Martha again said, "You'll be ordained this summer, because if you can't do it in Texas, it'll happen somewhere else. Don't worry about that. We will take care of you." She was very, very supportive and solicitous, and the bishop finally told the dean of the cathedral that he needed to create a position on his staff for me, else I could not be ordained. And I didn't know Joe at the time, the dean. Had never met him. He didn't know me either, but I now know the bishop just told him, "You have to do this." So he did, and I was at the cathedral for 2 years, which was great. After I was ordained a deacon, 6 months later rolled around, and it was time to ordain a priest. All my other deacons that I was ordained with had their dates set and were beginning to be ordained, and I didn't have a date yet when the bishop would come ordain me at the cathedral. And I'd call every week, "Not yet, not yet, sorry, not yet, not yet." So finally the dean called and said, can I, the bishop, have some time for me tomorrow? And she said yes. And then he said, okay. Then he told her what it was about. He said, tell her that Blake and I will be there tomorrow to talk about his ordination, and hung up. So off we went. And we came into a room that was me and Bishop Brimley on a love seat. The dean was there. The canon of the ordinaries that was there, who's now Bishop Doyle, Dina Harrison, Bishop Suffolkin was there, and 2 other canons were there, I think. And it was the same kind of experience as at seminary. They went around the room, and everybody but the bishop spoke, gave their thoughts on how I should begin to live a life back in the closet. I was jeopardizing the bishop's mission. I didn't know all the slings and arrows that the bishop was getting on because of me, et cetera, et cetera. It's really, really awful. I knew Andy Doyle, the canon of the ordinary, who's now the bishop in Texas. He and I had talked a lot over those 6 months that I was home, and he was very much my advocate and friend. And he told me, out of school, that he and the bishop had shouting matches over my ordination, and that the bishop, in fact, he said, you need to know. He finally came around to the position that you needed to be ordained, but it's still hard for him to see a way to do that publicly, even though he knows that's the right thing to do. And then he said, Don and I have shed tears over this. Andy and I, when he was canon of the ordinary, we shed tears over it all. So anyway, they all spoke, and the dean of the cathedral had urged me not to speak, that he would speak on my behalf. And I said, Joe, I don't know. I'm 50 years old, 51 years old. I can't promise that. If I think I need to speak, I'm going to speak. I can't. I'm not 22 years old. We'll see. So I didn't say anything to anybody. Nobody asked me a question directly. They all just wanted to talk. The dean hadn't spoken, and we were hip to hip on a love seat, sitting together. So he elbowed me in the side and looked at me finally. I looked at him, and he said, "Oh, Blake, what do you think about all this?" And I looked at him, still looking at him. I said, I spent too much of my life in the closet and talking about myself and my life in ways that made other people happy and didn't make other people uncomfortable or mad. But I stopped doing that about 20 years ago. And I'm not going to start doing it again. If that's a requirement for me, then I just won't be ordained. I'll just stay a deacon. Well, the Bishop Wimberly just freaked out. Jumped up to the middle of the room, looked at everybody who'd been talking, not all of whom were in the negative, but he looked at, and Joe too, pointed to each one of them and said, we're finished talking about this. This is a done deal. He's going to be ordained. He yelled for Rebecca to come in with his calendar. She came in. He said, what's my first open date in the next 10 days? She told him it was. And he said, Joe, can the cathedral be ready that night? And he said, yes. And he said, don't you need to check? And Dean said, not in the mood you're in right now. No, we don't need to check. Whatever you say to do, we're going to do. So we had to finally agree to a date, and we came to the ordination. And so all my other mates had been ordained by that already. And we're sitting in staff meeting at the cathedral that day, and that morning as it happened. And the canon precentor, the liturgical guy, said, well, how many rows should we reserve for visiting priests? You've been to the ordination. How many people are making those trips? I said, oh, there's, the altar party is one thing, but the people just in the crowd, there's probably, I don't know, 8, 10, 12. I said, okay, we'll set 2 or 3 rows aside. I said, that's more than we need anywhere else. So the bishop and I are getting dressed in what's called the bride's room at the cathedral and get all vested up. And then we go around to the Mellinger room, the parlor, so to speak, a much bigger room where the clergy was vesting. And there were 70 people there, 70 clergy at camp. And the bishop began to cry. He's a big crier. He said, I just can't believe this. And I said, well, I'm overwhelmed too. So it was a wonderful night. It took forever to get into the church. The procession was just incredible. Dean Mark Dwyer came to preach the sermon. And he had just come back at that point from helping to write the Windsor Report, which was not universally received by the progressive end of the church by any means. But it was as good as it was going to be. And it was as good as it was because he was there. And it would have been worse if he had not been there. It was my opinion, still is. And he and I had been close all along. I ushered his and Amy's wedding, and was there when his son died. On campus when his son died. So that was great. He came to preach, and it was a wonderful night. Then 2 years go by, and it's time to fly the nest at the cathedral. And there's the list of churches that are open looking for a senior associate or a rector or a priest in charge, and nobody who has an opening will call me. Here we go again. So that's how I ended up in Poughkeepsie, New York for 8 years. Then after that, I was canon of the ordinary in New York for 5 years. And then back here to work for Bishop Andy Doyle, moved from being canon of the ordinary to bishop for a year as transition officer. And now I'm here as interim rector at a small parish in Huntsville, where the state prison system is, Huntsville Prison, and all the administrative offices. A very, very conservative redneck town, but the mainline churches, First Christian, United Methodist, Presbyterian, and us are all far to the left of the center on progressive issues. So it's all in all, it's a great place to be, to no doubt end my active career as a priest. Long journey since Virginia, but the same kind of stories tend to keep coming up.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you for agreeing to add your voice to the voices that we're collecting. Is there anything else you'd like to share before I stop recording?
One great event in the senior year was with the dean's approval, I invited Louis Crew to come to campus and give a talk about LGBT history in the church writ large. And he called me that night and said, oh, he'd be glad to come. And we organized the trip and all that. And he came, and we had a crowd of about 30 or 40 students that came to that. And I did not know until he told the story at the time that he'd been invited to VTS earlier, like probably in the early 90s, mid 90s. And by some students with the approval of the dean. And at that gathering, he was ridiculed and not allowed to present his talk without interruption, and being criticized, and finally had to stop and just leave the presentation in the campus. So he said that had always been a scar for him. Sort of not at the institution because they did approve his invitation, but sort of at the institution because there were students there who could comport themselves like that to anybody in the church. So he was very touched and moved to be back emotionally, spiritually, I think. And he told us that to come back. And I was so glad that, I mean, if I'd known the original story, I would have definitely, doubled down to get him there. But I just thought it would be a good thing for, some students from other places to get exposed to a grand old man of the LGBT, the grand old man of the LGBT faction or arm or whatever of the church. And so it was great. No one came who was vehemently opposed to the whole issue. One of my classmates who was in that reactionary crowd that was so mean to Ruth Ann when she arrived, after graduation, literally after graduation, we still had mailboxes then. It was the only way to communicate with students, really. So everybody was there all the time. So the seniors went by for one last, to look at your mailbox first. We all took off. And there was a letter from Kevin Seaver, addressed to the student, to our class. And he was so glad to be able to shake the dust of VTS off his feet, to walk away from all of us and no longer be contaminated by our heretical, sinful support of LGBT people and issues. It's just awful, so hateful. And he was at Virginia from the Church of Japan. He'd gone over to teach English and fell in love with a woman, Japanese woman, and stayed and got married and had a career, got involved in the church, came back, his wife came with him and their child. So he goes back to Japan at the end of our senior year, that same senior year that I had the problem with my parish because of the national church confirming Gene's election. And, the worldwide church is erupting at this time. And eventually one national church has a resolution in support of the United States, of the Episcopal Church of the United States. It says, we all have our right to figure out our own path, and they have figured out theirs, and we need to leave them alone. Quit criticizing them. Unanimously from the House of Bishops in Japan. So Kevin had gone back to a place where at least the bishops then were completely in disagreement with his just hateful expression of his theological point of view. I don't know what's become of him since. I don't know. I wish he and his family well. I guess his son's probably in college by now, maybe out. I think that that was the very last day of life at VTS. So I think that's the last thing to say. I do hope I can contact some other folk and get them in touch with you so you can hear their stories too.
Please do. And again, thank you so much for sharing your story with me.
Yeah, it was a blessing. Brought back lots of memories, mostly good, all good to remember, and mostly good memories. So I really am glad that this project's underway. Thanks so much, and good luck with it.
Thank you.
If I get back to convocation in October, I'll look you up.
All right.
Okay, thanks.